Actually, normally I do the intros, but I think maybe that make sense for you to do the welcome and set everything up.
Okay, cool. Looks like we're still getting fairly rapid sign-ins here. So welcome to those who are hopping on. I'm going to give the official intro here in just a moment. Just wait another minute or so to see if we get more folks logged on. For everybody's awareness, we're playing around with streaming live on YouTube. And it will also be recorded and put into the repository of OpenTEAM deep dives. Okay, looks like the pace of sign-ons has slowed a little bit. I'm going to hit record. And all right, well, welcome to this OpenTEAM deep dive. I'm Gregory. Dorn has passed the baton on for the introduction to me for today. And I'm really excited to introduce Kevin from the Gitcoin team, who's going to be giving us a deep dive on Quadratic funding. And yeah, I'm really interested in the subject. I think it's very pertinent to a lot of the conversations that we have as OpenTEAM members around how, who decides what to fund and how do we make those decisions in a way that optimizes the generation of these public goods and solid open source code and serves our users. And so there's this amazing experiment within the crypto community that Gitcoin has been one of the leaders of around exploring quadratic funding as one way to approach how we fund public goods. And yeah, with that, I'm gonna just take a quick pause. I'm going to make sure, Kevin, that you are now the host so that you can share your screen. And
okay,
and I'll pass it over to you, Kevin, to take it from here. Thanks so much for joining and being generous with your time to give us a little bit of a deep dive into quadratic funding.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me, Greg. Glad to make the connection. And yeah, excited about digital democracy and what we can do with more democratic funding mechanisms, and curious to see what comes out of this discussion. So hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Owocki. Just getting a little bit of a read of the room. I put you guys in gallery view right here so I can see at least everyone who has their video on. And as I understand it, Greg kind of explained that this group has a little bit more of a sort of like free software / like farming bent. Just want to sort of like get a read of the room before I dive in. Is that sort of more or less right? Okay, cool. Yeah, so my background is that I have a degree in computer science and I've been building web applications all of my life. I'm actually sitting in my backyard and you can maybe see over my shoulder that my wife and I are just starting to get into gardening a little bit. That's a garden bed like right over there. But I'm not very pro when it comes to agricultural stuff.
Just to interrupt for just a moment, Kevin.
Sure.
The Jeff Herrick, who's here, is also in Boulder. So Kevin, you two are cohabitants of Boulder County, I believe.
Okay. Oh,
so,
well, hi, Jeff.
I don't recognize anybody without their masks anymore, so I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I look like everyone else in Boulder with my long hair and beard, so yeah. Well, great to make the connection. Praise be to the great state of Colorado. I think it's a great place to start a family out here. So the title of my presentation is called WTF is QF. QF stands for quadratic funding. And I'm basically doing quadratic funding pilots as part of my work as the founder of the Gitcoin project, which is basically our mission is to grow and sustain open source software. And so we're trying to come up with more democratic mechanisms for funding open source software, and quadratic funding is a pillar of that. So quadratic funding is an economics paper. You can actually Google it and read the whole 40-page paper. But I'll save you some of the math and some of the some of the more dry parts of the paper. And hopefully wrap this up in a little bit more of a fun, neon engaging conversation. So Quadratic funding is the baby of two economists, Vitalik Buterin, who is the founder of the Ethereum project, and Glenn Weil, who is the founder of Radical Exchange and of liberal radicalism, which is basically exploring ideas for creating digital democracy, liberalism, classical liberalism in a digital world. And so these two got together. I like to say that they, two economists walk into a bar and they start thinking about how to fund public goods. But the truth is that they met on the internet and came up with this idea for something that's called quadratic funding. And basically what quadratic funding is it's this formula that this magic formula, which basically says that you can create a set of projects which are all competing with each other for capital, and that the amount given to each project is equal to the square root of all of the sum of all the square roots of all of the contributions squared. And so basically what this is a formula that optimizes that basically sets up a crowdfunding campaign, and the amount given to each project is going to be proportional more to the number of contributors to the project, not the amount that each of the contributors contributed. And so basically what's really exciting about this, and I'm going to give examples that don't require a background in math in order to understand this, is that it's the mathematically optimal way to democratically fund public goods. And the reason for that is that it actually optimizes for the number of contributors, not the amount that each contributor uses. And so basically what we've done on Gitcoin is we've set up a matching fund of about $200,000 per quarter. And basically what we do is we ask the community to contribute to open source projects. And the idea here is that it really changes the psychology of contributing to open source projects because, and you can just see from the screenshot of the Gitcoin UI that this project right here, if you contribute one DAI, which in cryptocurrency, one DAI is equal to $1, then you can get 64 DAI in matching contributions to the project. So it creates this interesting effect in which a $1 contribution can get $64 in matching. And that's a really powerful psychological barrier to get people past in order to contribute to open source software, because they're actually having such a large impact with their contributions. So quadratic funding is happening now on the Gitcoin platform. And basically our mission is to grow and sustain open source software. So the entire Gitcoin project is oriented around this idea that open source software is a digital first public good, and that it creates billions of dollars a year in economic value, but because there's no business model for it. So open source software developers are not able to capture the value that they create in the world. And we want to right that wrong. We think it's not fair that open source software developers are creating so much value and they have to work for these giant corporations during the day in order to be able to pay their mortgage. And so we're trying to right that wrong. Basically, one of the cool things about the Gitcoin project is now that we actually have funding for open source software because of blockchain networks. So I don't think this group is a very blockchainy group, but just like a very high level overview, there's now $300 billion in market cap of open source financial instruments that have been created in the wake of the Bitcoin white paper. And all of those projects, when they need software developers, are now doing it in open source. So all of the money that used to go to Wall Street is some back office on Wall Street in the old financial system is now going to open source software. And it's sort of Gitcoin's goal to create a mechanism which deploys that capital. So basically, we've created a social network where software developers can earn, learn, and meet other software developers all in a sort of open source native type of way. And Gitcoin Grants is where we actually put a lot of this work into practice. So basically, you can go to gitcoin.co/grants and you'll see that we actually have a matching pool going on right now that's using quadratic formula to fund open source software. And this is an example of what a Gitcoin grant looks like. This is for Radical Exchange, which is a nonprofit organization building markets and technology to create liberal radicalism, basically digital democracy. And as I showed you about 5 minutes ago, this is sort of the user interface for donating to a Gitcoin grant. And it's really, really powerful, particularly for grants that have a broad amount of support to be able to raise from the community and get matched with quadratic funding and earn cryptocurrency with the quadratic funding campaign. So a brief overview of the work that we've done thus far with Gitcoin grants. Basically, we have these matching rounds that we run every quarter. And the cool thing about them is that it really allows us to iterate every quarter off of what we learn off of the data. So the first round that we did of matching was we raised about 40K for open source software through 200 contributions. And this graph right here on my screen is an expression of the preferences of the group in the matching campaign. So each node of the network is a person, and each edge is a contribution from a person to a person. So we're building a peer-to-peer network of financing using cryptocurrency and using quadratic funding. And as I roll through this sort of reel, what you're going to see is that round 2 had 400 contributions and raised about 50% more than round 1, and that the network of preferences gets denser each time that we run this. So we're basically figuring out how to get more people to contribute to public goods. In round 3, we did 2,000 contributions and raised almost 300K, which is like a 400% increase after round 2. Round 4, we did 5,000 contributions and raised 350K. And you can see that the network of preferences has gotten much, much richer. And then round 5, we raised about $500,000 with 8,000 contributions for open source software. And so basically, this is driving completion of Gitcoin's mission. We want to build a world in which open source software developers can just work for the open internet. They don't have to work for a large corporation in order to pay their mortgage, support their family, stuff like that. The Gitcoin network itself has driven about $5 million worth of value to open source software developers. And this is all live today. We've got Gitcoin grants round 6, which is going on right now. It has raised about 300K, and the campaign is about 1/3 of the way through. But we're hoping to continue breaking records with how much money we can raise with quadratic funding in round 6. And so from here, we basically have figured out that quadratic funding is a really powerful psychological motivator for our community. And so we're going to be taking it out of just the cryptocurrency niche that we're working on, and we're going to be bringing it more to a mainstream audience. And so what we're doing is we're launching what's called downtownstimulus.com, and it's going to be a way of supporting local businesses that were affected by the coronavirus pandemic with quadratic funding. So basically, Trident is my friend Andrew's campaign down here in Boulder, Colorado, and it's basically this amazing place that Jeffrey, I don't know if you've ever been there, but basically it's been a Buddhist bookstore and coffee shop for the last 40 years in downtown Boulder. Yeah, cool. And yeah, so we're basically just going to allow people to donate with US dollars to support the economic recovery to the downtown in Boulder, Colorado. And the whole idea is that having a livable downtown is a public good. And I'm really miffed at how much of this government stimulus money has gone to large corporations, and we have this formula for distributing in a very democratic way stimulus money. So we're going to be running a pilot, a 30K pilot of this in July, and really excited to see what happens with that. We're expanding into other blockchains. So we've done QF campaigns with Ethereum, but we're expanding into Matic, Zcash, Polkadot. These are not names that you would know if you're not in the cryptocurrency ecosystem. and we're doubling down on Ethereum, which is the cryptocurrency that Gitcoin is built upon. So basically, this is from Vitalik Buterin, who, if you follow crypto, you know that he's the founder of the Ethereum project, and his blog post says that Gitcoin Grants is establishing itself as a significant pillar of the Ethereum ecosystem, which I'm really proud of, because people will come up to me and say, hey, the project that I'm working on got off the ground because of Gitcoin Grants. So it's really starting. One of our metrics is how many people whose lives can we change with Quadratic funding, and I think that we're starting to see dozens of them in the Ethereum community, and we're not stopping here. We have plans to basically go from 500K a quarter to $5 million per quarter of open source funding. And I'm really excited over the next several years to see that come to fruition. So that's sort of like the more tangible part of my presentation. I do have some more like abstract and like philosophical things that I want to talk about with digital democracy, but I'd love to stop there, maybe have a discussion, field some questions, and then we can get into the weirder stuff after that. So, you know, of the 9 people on this call, what do you think of what I've told you so far? Is there anything you don't understand? Let's jam, let's nerd out, and we can continue the conversation from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. One quick question. Who's providing the matching funding in the Boulder, downtown Boulder instance?
We basically crypto people that want to see Quadratic funding used in the real world is like half of the round. And then I'm also fairly well connected in the Boulder startup community and managed to squeeze a couple $1,000s out of local startup founders and local philanthropists. The idea with the pilot is just to prove that we can do this in the real world. And then we'd love to do a 200K round in downtown Boulder. And part of the idea is that economic stimulus money that either comes from the local, state, or federal level, more of it should go to Quadratic funding as opposed to these large banks who are giving out the stimulus money right now. So eventually we'd love to be pitching city councils across the country to do Quadratic funding rounds.
Cool. I have lots of questions, but I don't want to be the one. I'm going to maybe pass
Well,
it
I
over
have a
to
question to
Sure.
so to what extent can this sort of toolkit be applied to within an existing open source community to help allocate, you know, funds? Which is directly relevant to the OpenTEAM community here. But part of what we're also, and this is sort of a 2-part question perhaps, we're also looking at, you know, as we set our own priorities, there's a wider world that may set a different priority. So there's sort of an interoperability between our core work and sort of this external work that may have additional use cases, additional values that also need to move forward. So I guess just to hear your comment in terms of using this as a kit that can be applied for governance, as well as sort of moving it out to these other different marketplaces.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so basically the goal with the downtown stimulus work is to be able to do the pilot and then franchise it across the world. That's aspirational right now. We are literally building the app and about to deploy it in a week or 2. And I'm sure that we're going to find a bunch of stuff that breaks, and we're going to update our code and do it all again. Everything we do at Gitcoin is open source. So, you know, you could copy our code base and deploy it to your community without our permission. And I think that's a feature, not a bug. We would be happy to sort of jam on what it would look like to do a pilot together where we bring the technical expertise and deploy it together. I'm not sure I understand sort of like the second part of your question, which I interpreted to be about the differences between.
Well, I guess I'll use it, and this would help clarify because as well. So, for example, so we're using GitLab as a community to help move and prioritize and triage all issues, and and we're using it in both, you know, in some cases where we're not even storing the code itself, but to help prioritize and aggregate our the conversations around prioritization. And so our process is going to yield certain priorities, but there's work that we've done in terms of triaging that others could look at that and come up with a different funding priorities
Yeah.
and layer on top of that. And so what I'm interested is like, how in that use case, how would we sort of make that process accessible and visible to have additional outcomes and additional funding streams to be
Yeah.
built on top of our own priority or process?
Yeah, for sure. I think that quadratic funding is really cool because not only does it reveal the preferences of your community, but it gets your community to fund the projects alongside some central entity. And so, you know, I could see running a quadratic funding round across a bunch of GitLab issues where basically the priority of those issues is based off of the from like the number of people who are willing to chip in $1 to them, not the amount of some like central whale who's chipping into them. But there's also this thing called quadratic voting. So I'm talking mostly about quadratic funding, and quadratic funding is basically voting with your dollars. There's also this thing called quadratic voting where basically you distribute like 100 vote credits to each member of your community, and they can just spend their vote credits on actual buying of votes for which issues are priorities. And it's just basically a way of doing quadratic funding with like coupons and vouchers instead of with quadratic voting. We don't have any integrations with GitLab or anything built like that, so you would have to roll your own. But I do think that QF is like, it's mathematically designed for democratically deciding what priorities are. And I don't know if it would solve your problems, but it would probably reveal some interesting preferences across the community if you could get people to vote on it a lot. I think it's cool though to sort of hear about how you're using GitLab and how you guys are prioritizing on, guys and girls are prioritizing on that. It's interesting experiment in digital democracy.
Just a thought here. I mean, it seems like, you know, a part of the matching funding could just essentially be put into a pool and then as an experiment, and then, you know, people can then I mean, there's different ways, but signal matching, like we could use in order to qualify for a vote, you actually have to sort of guarantee your matching in terms of the grant framework that we have, you know, that you're willing to put this much in order to move it along. And if nothing else, it would, as Kevin's saying, it was sort of like visualize what the people who are participating in the ecosystem are willing to, you know, sort of pitch in on in a protocolized way, you know, where it would just sort of, you know, automate, like people could go through a voting cycle and then we'd see.
Yeah, and to be clear, like you can just do like a direct one-to-one vote. But, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do here is protect against some like very powerful entity basically like buying all the vote with all their credits. And so this is basically optimized to surface things that a broad number of the community actually cares about, as opposed to like a one-to-one vote where things could sway towards, you know, an extreme candidate or an extreme priority based off of, you know, who's got the power in the network.
Great.
Hey, Kevin, I joined a few minutes late, so apologies if you already covered this. Sure. So with your voting, does this take place after a contribution has come in, or is this like pre-voting to say like, these are the things that prioritize? And then if you go and deliver, like you commit your code, then you get paid out?
Yeah, first, Kevin's Unite, cool name. And then, so the answer to your question is that we run a matching calculator on the Gitcoin Grants UI. So basically, you can go to any Gitcoin grant and you can basically see the existing match estimates and how much, if you contribute $1, I'm not sure at what point you joined, but one DAI is basically equal to $1. It's just a crypto stablecoin where one DAI equals $1. So I can contribute $1 and this grant will get a $200 match. And so basically, if I were to go through the checkout flow, then this estimate would just this estimate would update as my contribution goes through. So it would recalculate the matching curve for all of the grants in the round, and then it would display a new number to the next person who comes along to vote their preferences. So I guess the answer is that it's instant that we update the estimates.
Okay, yeah, but my question is slightly different. So
Okay.
I'm funding a pool of grants, or sorry, a grant pool, and then that grant pool is distributed based on contributions by those individuals that deliver something within a time period.
So I understand what you're asking now. Basically, quadratic voting and quadratic funding is basically to reveal the preferences of a market. And if that market cares about what was delivered since the last funding round, then they'll vote with their dollars in a rational economic sense. They'll vote with their dollars for the grants that have been delivering in the last 3 months. If they don't care about that, if they care about something else, then they'll vote based off of those preferences. But we don't like check your Git commits and like make sure that you're, like we don't have like funding thresholds where we release off these milestones or anything like that. Part of the idea here is that Gitcoin is just administering the round, but we're not becoming a centralized intermediary that's basically telling people how to spend their money or when to spend their money. We're just letting the market reveal its preferences here. So we don't have any sort of like stuff that checks where are you committing code and are you doing X, Y, or Z. We're just trying to surface the information to the market and let the market decide.
Okay, but is the market putting their vote towards a particular feature set, or just saying I encourage open source development on this project?
They're putting, so each grant has a description in it which talks about use of funds and what the project is, and they're voting for whatever is in that grant description. Like this example that I just showed here is this guy named Samsung, who basically like goes around and hacks crypto projects, and he's so notoriously well known that like he literally has a 1-line description in his grant. I find bugs in projects. Sometimes they're running on the mainnet. Sometimes there's a lot of money at stake, and this is the best way to do it. And like he's literally he'll probably raise like 20K by the end of the round. So it's really just about whatever the grant owner puts into the description and whether the market finds that valuable or not. This guy just has such a brand halo around him because he's like literally saved people millions of dollars that I think that like they don't care that it's only a 1-line grant description.
So I wonder if you might walk through another, somebody who is approaching with a new project and what that might look like sort of from concept to funding. So round 1 to round 2.
Yeah, so you mean like a project within a quadratic funding round, or like a new quadratic funding experiment?
Yeah, walking through one of your rounds with something that hasn't been on there before. What would that look like for a new project to enter into?
Yeah. Hey, Greg, does Regen Network have a Gitcoin grant? I could put one up right now just to like demo it.
We don't, but that sounds fun. Let's do it.
Okay,
I'll probably look like. Yeah.
I will probably screw up the describing your project, so maybe I'll just put up a test grant. But we, at some point should get your project on here and start raising some money for the project you're doing. So basically, this is the create grant form right here. And basically the idea here is that I can upload a logo, put in a project title, put in a project description, and then put in a website. Name some team members. So I don't think you all are really on the Gitcoin platform, but and then basically once I've got that information collected, I can specify basically what tokens I want to raise. And this is like a crypto specific thing, so maybe you guys don't care about the token part of things, but if I just click create grant right here, then it's going to create a new Gitcoin grant that people like. I can start distributing this grant to people on my social feeds or on my wherever I want to wherever I want to market my grant. So it's really just as simple as filling out a form to put up a grant, and then you start marketing it to people who have crypto that you believe will want to support your grant. So it's just kind of like a one-page form to fill out a project title and description in order to post a new one.
So it's essentially what Quadratic funding does is it fuses crowdfunding with a matching pool, and it distributes that match according to the number of different participants in a crowdfunding campaign.
Yep, exactly. And so it's called capital constrained liberal radicalism. That's the economist name for what we're doing. So you've got constrained amount of capital that a bunch of different grants will compete for that same amount of capital. And there's a matching formula that figures out where the capital goes. And that formula is optimized for the broadest number of participants supporting a grant, not the richest people supporting a grant.
Got it.
Yeah, maybe I should add that to my slide deck now that I've, like Greg just explained in 2 paragraphs what it is.
So some of the places that I have thought about this is, one is the Secretariat could potentially be using this for some sort of sub-matching. This is also maybe something that's interesting to FAR and other like larger, funding agencies, where essentially they're just sort of saying, look, we have this matching pool and it's up to projects to run a crowdfunding campaign. And this is a distribution, this formula helps us distribute to the projects that are popular. And in this case, popularity is willingness to contribute and to, because we're talking about building software. So it's sort of like who has the most users and contributors gets, relatively more access to that grant. So it's, and the usual way I see this happening in our ecosystem is much less agile than that. So like the process to distribute a couple $1 million is very, it's sort of like long bureaucratic cycles. And in this case, I think it's much more, okay, there's like this constrained amount of capital, and it's going to be distributed according to what the signals are in terms of contributors. And then, it's sort of time bound, and everybody participates in a month, and then the capital contributions are dispersed, and then people are working according to those capital contributions.
So like what we really want to do is we want to remove the central power brokers from deciding who gets funded. And we want to push the power out to the edges so that we can distribute the funds based off of, do your peers respect this project, not does some faraway bureaucrat respect the project. And so it's a formula that sort of enforces that. And the other cool thing is that it doubles your money if you're trying to fund a group of projects. So basically, we start every Gitcoin grant round with 200K in matching funds, which if we just distributed that directly to the community, we could fund 20 projects with 10K each. But the cool thing about Gitcoin grants and Quadratic funding is that we're actually raising money from the community alongside that. So basically that 200K matching pool will be matched with 200K from the community. And the cool thing about that is that you basically doubled the amount that you're pumping into an ecosystem, because you're getting the crowd to fund stuff also. All right, so we're about 35 minutes in. Greg, what should we do with the remainder of the time? What do you all want to talk about? I'd love to either continue jamming, or I can get into a few more slides. It sort of depends on where the group is at.
Well, I'll open it up to see if there's other questions. One question I had is, could you envision sort of multiple, like in the crypto space, it'd be multiple forms of tokens. But I'm sort of thinking, is there a possibility for in-kind and cash match? Like in our world, that there's like multiple forms of accounting, and one is like how much I'm contributing in dollars to a feature, and the other might be how much labor I'm contributing. And is that complexity sort of break the math here, or is that something that is conceivably possible to integrate?
Yeah, it's possible to integrate. Basically, you just have to have a common unit of account, so you're comparing apples to apples with the quadratic funding formula. The way we do it with Gitcoin is that you can contribute any cryptocurrency tokens, but the amount that we feed into the matching formula is just based off of the US dollar equivalent of it. So, you could run with the Regen network, you could run a dollar campaign, and those dollars could be added to some sort of like-kind contribution, whether it's crops or hourly wages. And as long as people are contributing in the form of something that can be converted to that common unit of account, then you can do it.
Cool.
So yeah, I guess the thing that comes to mind here again is that we're also constrained in terms of our priorities by the available developer hours, and I think there's an appeal to putting some of these issues out to a wider community and sort of in a registry
Yeah.
where there's more generalizable or additional, not only bringing more dollars into the ecosystem, but more
Yeah.
a larger developer community. So
Yeah.
I guess, do you have any thoughts in terms of how that sort of that fits in terms of just, again, both bringing more dollars, but again, expanding these communities? And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's it's pretty common to be constrained by complexity and by labor hours and not just money. If I understood your question, it was like, how would we move forward with something like this without like burning all of our developer hours on building the infrastructure to do it, as opposed to it was that sort of the question, or was it more like within the formula, how does it
Yeah, no, that was,
optimize for,
I was assuming that, that the platform worked just perfectly and you could implement
yeah,
it, but then it's still then matching.
yeah,
It's also, uh, you know, we may have a large need that we've identified as a community, and we have some of the developer resources, but we've deprioritized it because it doesn't fit within the current development cycle. But it would still be useful to be able to use that to, as part of that funding, is to expand the pool so we can be bidding on that, so we could bring others into that, expand that developer pool.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of what we're trying to build at Gitcoin is developers on demand. So
That's what I'm
basically,
getting at.
yeah, yeah. And so, there's this allegory with, when I first started off my career, if you wanted to host a website, you would have to buy a server and then rack it at a data center and, set it up and administer it and all that kind of stuff. And now we just go to Amazon and we click launch instance, and then it's available then. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do for developer jobs. Just basically build a liquid marketplace of developers that are looking for work, and basically make it so that you can post a well, right now crypto bounty, but eventually any US dollars you could use. And the idea is that we can instantly market your work out to our 40,000 software engineers. And I think that like we have to be really careful about how we do this, right? Because there's some things wrong with the gig economy when you look at it vis-a-vis Upwork and Uber and stuff like that, which is like, we can get into it if you want, but basically I think that like one of the things we're trying to do with Gitcoin being an open source network is align people not only with work that they can use to pay their mortgage, but work that aligns with their values. And so from what I know about Regen Network and the work that Greg is doing, I think that a lot of people really care about agriculture, no farms, no food kind of stuff. And so connecting you with a software developer that has the right skills, but also has the sort of like mission put together and hopefully a long-term stake in the project is kind of the world that we want to build. But yeah, yes, I mean, I guess if you need software developers, like send me an email with a job description, and I have literally 40,000 that I'm trying to help find their next thing. So yeah, send that to me and I can try to hook it up.
Great. Super helpful. Thanks, Kevin.
You bet.
So if there's other questions out there, please chime in. Otherwise, Kevin may be doing another cycle and taking us into the next layer.
The next layer, yeah. Yeah, so are there more questions? If not, I could spend 5 or 10 minutes on the more abstract stuff.
That'd be great.
Alrighty. Well, let me tell you about basically sort of like the long-term end game of what I view that we're doing right here. Share my screen. All right, so basically what I think that we're doing in the blockchain space and with quadratic funding is programming the incentives of the next epoch of the web. So basically, when I think about what we're doing, I think about this thing called heuristic maximalization, which just basically means like, what are the incentives in the world? And as people in the world, what are the incentive gradients that we're trying to climb? Which is just like a math and engineering-y way of saying like, oh, I want my bank account to be higher next week than it is this week. And so I'm going to work at this job to provide for my family. And so the thing is that the economy is set up in such a way that there's these incentive gradients where you want to climb these hills and you want to avoid traps that will suck value out of your community and out of your project. And so I think a lot about heuristic maximalization, especially vis-a-vis the differing incentives in the world. For example, I may have one heuristic that I'm optimizing my bank account, and I may be incentivized in order to make my bank account go up, in order to make a trade-off that affects the long-term climate, the environmental degradation around me that's created by the first incentive gradient is with this vis-a-vis the second gradient. So I think it would be better if we lived in a world in which the incentives that people had to follow were aligned with each other. So what if we could augment the incentive gradients in the world such that doing something good for the world would be aligned with your economic incentive. And so basically, as we look into the different like time preferences of humanity and basically the different incentive gradients, how do we build a web where incentives are aligned along the short-term, mid-term, and long-term landscape, or like the economic and the moral landscape of what we're doing is aligned with each other. And so basically what I view with what we're doing with developer jobs is trying to slightly augment the incentive gradients of the world. And one of the things that I think is a really interesting way to splice this is with this idea called bentoism, which is basically this idea of, instead of just optimizing for a world in which you're producing returns for you right now, what if we expanded our horizon into this thing called bentoism, which is basically, instead of just optimizing for now me, what if we optimize for now us and future me and future us? So the idea is that like sometimes markets are basically there's a trade-off in which you can create a payoff, a fitness payoff for now me, but basically you're trading off, you're like arbitraging your future self or the future of your community. And so basically, what if we could augment the incentives of a community such that basically, and I'm going to use this example of open source software, where when you use open source software, you get a great benefit of not having to reinvent a web server or a database server, but you're kind of like creating a marginal cost for someone else to support you. So what if we could use quadratic funding in order to change the incentives of the trade-off of what's good for you and what's good for us, and basically make it so that you can spend $1 and get $74 worth of matching for the commons. And that's what really makes me excited about the work that we're doing with quadratic funding. It's supporting what's called public goods. So basically, public goods are goods that are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. as opposed to private goods like consumer goods like foods and clothes and cars. Public goods are things like are things like clean air. So basically, we all want to live in a world in which we're breathing clean air. We can avoid lung cancer, and we can avoid basically degrading our long-term health. We all want to live in a world in which there's great infrastructure. So basically, roads and bridges, and not a lot of traffic to go from A to B. We want to. One of the causes that my community really cares about is privacy. So basically, we want to live in a world in which people can't spy on you. And surveillance capitalism, I think, is a real problem in the view of this community. So basically, we want to build an internet that supports public goods. And those are goods that are non-excludable, which means that you can't stop people from consuming them, and non-rivalrous, which means like the fact that I consume clean air doesn't really stop Greg from consuming clean air. And so what we're building with Quadratic funding is on an individual basis, on a per actor basis, the incentive mechanism to contribute to public goods in a digital first world. So right now, I think a lot of people's ideas of public goods are tied up with government, and it's messy whether or not people support the government or believe in the government. So if you can use markets to support public goods in the information age, then I think that that's a really exciting thing to be working on right now. And when I think about what we're doing, I think it's building democracy in the 21st century. And so when I think about the constraints that we're augmenting with Quadratic funding, I think about the constraints of humanity and basically what's holding us back from reaching the next epoch of our evolution. And this one might be the most far outside that I have, but I'm just gonna get into it anyway. So basically, we're constrained by the laws of mathematics and physics, by the power structures of today's society, by the laws of today's society, by media, finance, and culture. And so as you go further up this stack, the more mutable or changeable these things are, whereas like we're never going to evolve past the laws of physics or mathematics, at least not within my lifetime. So what we're doing with Quadratic funding is we're augmenting our community and the way we intermediate our experience from a financial and cultural experience. And the idea here is that with Quadratic funding, we can create a stack of more democratic funding mechanisms that isn't based off of the existing power structures of late 20th century industrial democracy, and is more rooted from first principles in the information age. And so that's one of the things that gets me really excited about waking up every morning and working on this problem, because when I really think about the transition from the industrial age to the information age, which just basically means that like our mechanism for organization is the web instead of these institutions that we've inherited from the baby boomers. I don't think we want to live in a dictator-driven network species where we're all dependent on one person or one administration for the goods that we receive. I don't think we want to live in an oligarchical network species. I think that we've been sort of talking about democracy and learned about democracy, at least I have, since I was a little kid. And so a more democratic way of allocating capital, or maybe a completely peer-to-peer way of allocating capital, is what really excites me about the experiments that we're doing with Gitcoin and Quadratic funding. And the cool thing is that Quadratic funding is all about you as the individual consumer and your preferences. So we basically got this network of three-dimensional humans that come from all different parts of the world, come from all different backgrounds. They can be male, female, short, tall, and have all these different socioeconomic backgrounds. And Quadratic funding reveals their preferences in a mesh network way. So basically, Quadratic funding is all about revealing the preferences of all these three-dimensional humans that are all consuming open source software and are all just trying to make a better world for themselves and their families. And in aggregate, we can figure out basically how to reveal the preferences and fund things in a more democratic way. So that's sort of like the macro vision for what we're doing with Quadratic funding and open source software. And my my big vision is that open source software is a public good. It's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And I think that there's a ton of public goods that we need to figure out how to plan for, and how to support public goods in the 21st century is a really open question for me. And so my real hope is that we can start with software engineers, and we can start with open source, and then we can build markets for all sorts of different public or common goods, community oriented goods. And it's just a matter of architecting the network, the finance stack, the culture, such that it's a democratic thing, as opposed to one where there's a central power broker who's making decisions for everyone in the network. So that's sort of my big vision, and I promised I would get weird before the end of this. And but that's what we're trying to do with Gitcoin, and that's what we're trying to do with Quadratic funding. So would be happy to jam on that, or if there's anything more tangible with respect to how we can work together, how Gitcoin or Regen and y'all can work together, I'd be happy to talk about that as well.
Well, thank you, Kevin.
You bet.
Just giving a moment to see if folks, it looks like Will just hopped off mute.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say a book that I started reading last night is called Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone by Astor Taylor. And is that one you're familiar with, Kevin? Or
I haven't heard of it, but it jives with my worldview just from only hearing the title.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that this conversation is getting into is some of the first principles around concepts like decentralization, like governance and democracy, and we've kind of been, for example, even the concept of quadratic funding, there's like a first principle there that there is a non-linear synergy that happens as more people join in on a project. That if you have 20 people working on something, you're going to get way more than double the results of what you would have if you had 10 people working on it.
Yep.
And so I guess I just bring up this book in part because it the structure of the book lays out all these dyads of like, for example, freedom and equality, which is now seen as like polarities on a spectrum, but it hasn't always been that way. Like, for example, the French Revolution, it was freedom, equality, and fraternity were kind of the triad of the French Revolution. And so just to say that I think it's easy to feel like we all have some kind of understanding of what these concepts mean. And it could be good for us to just investigate some of our first principles here of what are the assumptions we have about how people work best together and how decisions are best made together. And
yeah, and I think that, yes, and I just added that book to my Amazon cart because I'm curious to think about it. But yes, and I think that one of my worldviews is that we're moving from an industrial centric society in which we move to cities and give us all these things, all these new consumer goods and art and sort of like huge communities, to a world in which we're intermediating our experiences using the web. We have Uber now, and we have Amazon, and so what does democracy look like in an information age as opposed to an industrial age? I think that the reason why we should inspect from first principles how we think about these things is because as we make that shift, I think there's a lot of risks, but there's also a lot of upside in how we organize.
I have a question sort of along those lines in terms of the preferences change through the round. So I think the time and influence of previous votes have an effect on future rounds. So I guess I'd like your comments on that, because as part of what we're doing is discovering new information and new priorities, and part of that has to do with visibility into what others' priorities are, and which you can make. So maybe if you want to just talk about that function of rounds and whether there's even discovery rounds that aren't funded, but just to help identify, sort of points of where there's for further conversation or iteration. and whether that's been discussed.
Yeah, all really great questions. I think we only have 3 or 4 minutes left, so we'll see how far I can get into it. But
and a number of us have to jump right off, so we're just sort of tee you up. But this,
yeah,
by the way, I'll sort of mention for the whole group and for you, Kevin, too. This is part of. We're going to be doing more themed in-depths that we'll put these in context, and this is one of the themes is funding open source projects in the commons. And so we hope that we'll have you back and others as well.
Yeah.
We're doing other deep dives, but because we're sort of wide ranging, trying to bring in a lot of these ideas to enrich the conversation, both on how do we do this from the technical side, how do we do it from the social, how do we, and then also bringing in the science. You know, we're really very much in terms of funding sort of the common improvement of environmental systems. Data-driven, you know, our values are driven by also a lot of things that are invisible to us right now, by geochemical systems that we're bringing into this conversation. So,
cool. Well, then I think that we might be kindred spirits in such way, and I'd be happy to come back. With respect to the actual question about recurring, basically support, like stable support across rounds. I will point you at Vitalik Buterin's review of Gitcoin grants round 5. And stability of income was a major theme of the review of Gitcoin grants round 5. Basically, there's 2 ways to do it. One is just making it easy in the UI to say, oh, instead of funding $5 to this project now, I want to fund $1 to the project every subsequent round for the next 5 rounds. That's, you know, recurring subscriptions are pretty popular thing in the internet right now, and so we think that there's a lot of upside in that. I also think that with quadratic funding, we're experimenting this round with having carryover matching from last round. So basically the idea is that you would have your contributions this round, and then we would also bring in some of the contributions from the last round and make it part of the quadratic funding formula for this round. And that provides like human beings need to be able to pay their mortgage every month, right? So you create that stability of income based off of the trajectory of how they performed last round. So those are 2 of the mathy ways to do it, but we're still very much exploring. This is the first inning for quadratic funding in the world, I think, and we're still figuring it out.
I just want to throw in here that at some point I'm really interested to do some thinking with some people who are smarter than me about using this kind of quadratic funding as a price mechanism for linking carbon to co-benefits. Because if you think about the number of different co-benefits that a unit of carbon has to the number of different people who benefit in their commons, you know, it's a really interesting way to essentially like price a public good in a meaningful way that's mathematically sound. So there's beyond just like our software and our organizing ourselves, there may actually be sort of like a hint as to how we think rationally about pricing, you know, ecosystem services, for instance.
Well, that's a great way to lead off. I see Jeff nodding his head too, because part of our solution around additionality is by segmenting more specifically the specific services rather than saying carbon in the ground is just one inherent asset and a good. It's really this flow of services that have different values depending on context and who's deriving benefits from that existence. And so I think that'd be a great follow-up conversation, Craig.
Yeah, we need to bring in people. I mean, I have sort of some hand wavy, you know, non-mathematical ideas about this, but we'd need to bring in some people who had a little bit more rigor in.
Yeah, well, perhaps the Yale group that we're. Would be good
yeah, and I mean, and Glenn Weil and Vitalik and other, you know, and Kevin, other people who are really digging into the sort of mathematical underpinnings of this sort of these price discovery mechanisms. It'd be really, I think it's such a fruitful and interesting conversation. So, you know, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to sort of, you know, use the pedestal here to, you know, just thank you, Kevin, for taking the time to introduce this really, I think, important and interesting topic and kind of opportunity for rethinking pricing and provision and public goods and how we value those and fund them.
Yeah.
So, you know, any last words from your end as we wrap this deep dive?
I'm working on how to take, I'm very verbose because I'm a software engineer. And so I'm working on making this into a talking point that I could like use on cable TV. And the latest one that I've come to and that I'll end on is that public goods are good. So
Yeah.
we need to educate people about public goods. Public goods are good.
Awesome.
Well,
Awesome.
It was great talking to you, Gregory. Thank you for having me and looking forward to hopefully joining in the future as well.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kevin. Thank you everybody for joining. And we'll get this, the video of this posted for you to share to colleagues if you think other people might be interested. So thanks.
Okay.
Thanks,
Sounds
everyone.
good. Bye, Greg. Nice meeting
Bye.
you all. Jeff, see you around Boulder.
That's good.
Bye.
Thanks, take care. Bye-bye.